Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to Lecture 5 of Unit 4. Today we will focus on immigration and urbanization, two areas that definitely came about as a result of the increased industrial capacity of the United States during the era, really 1860 through the early 1900s. Both of these have tremendous impact on America and its growth at this point in time. First, let's take a look at why so many immigrants came to the United States. So between 1865 and 1920, 30 million immigrants entered the United States. And there were a variety of reasons why they came. First of all, religious persecution in many parts of the world were still leading to people wanting to come to the United States. Ireland was experiencing the Great Potato Famine. This resulted in more than 1 million Irish moving to the United States. Now, the Irish, mainly when they immigrated to the United States, resided in cities. They came over. Most of them were unskilled laborers. They found work in the cities, in factories, doing manual labor and things of that nature. Right behind the Irish, the next country to send the most immigrants to the United States during this period of time were the Germans. Germany was undergoing a number of issues as well. Many of these were political issues. Bismarck was leading Germany at the time, and the poor were fairly oppressed in Germany. And so the Germans came over. They didn't really like living in the cities. Many of them were farmers. So the majority of Germans settled in the Midwest of the United States. Many of them were farmers. And interestingly enough, this is where America got much of its brewing background from. Germans were big beer drinkers, and so some significant names to come over and start brewing in America were Frederick Pabst, Joseph Schlitz, and Adolf Busch. I'm sure that you can recognize many of those names because of their influence on the beer industry. Mexico also began to send more immigrants to the United States, and this was because the United States had pursued a project of figuring out how to irrigate the Southwest to make it more conducive to farming. And so once the New Lands Reclamation Act was finished, there was a demand for workers, migrant workers really, to do much of the labor in the Southwest of the United States. Much of this can be summed up of reasons why they came was opportunity. Opportunity for money, opportunity for jobs. Basically, immigration was producing and leading to an incredible amount of jobs. And in most cases, these immigrants coming over, were seeking better conditions than where they were coming from, which was, obviously the case. And finally, the steamboat made the trip much safer and quicker. Prior to this, it would take a month or more to get from, Europe to the United States. Now, it was basically 8 to 12 days. 8 to 12 days they could be in the United States and ready to start their new life.
A whole new world, a new fantastic point of view. No one to tell us no, or where to go, or say we're only dreaming.
In this graph, you can see how immigration grew. It correlates directly to industrialization, the height of industrialization. But there was really a continual growth. In the 1890s, there was somewhat of a letdown there. That was because the Irish potato famine was over. But continuous growth with immigrants coming into America. And here is just a chart that shows you all the way from 1820 to 1996 the countries that have sent the most legal immigrants to the United States. Okay, remember, this is legal immigration. There's a big difference between legal and illegal immigration. Obviously, Germany had sent the most, Mexico, Italy, Great Britain, Ireland, and you can read down from there. Now, coming into the United States was not difficult. There were entry points both on the East Coast and the West Coast. On the East Coast, Ellis Island was the entry point. It was a welcoming center. Between 1840 and 1914, the entire era of industrialization, over 40 million immigrants came to the United States. Okay? And this is where they entered in, were registered, documented, and so forth. So in New York, Ellis Island is where the European immigrants came, those from Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, so forth. They came and they were treated very well. They were helped. They were told where they could possibly find work, maybe put in contact with any relatives that they had already living here. So this was the case at Ellis Island. On the West Coast, Angel Island was located in San Francisco Bay, and this was entirely different. The Chinese especially had been coming over since 1850, working in the mines and building the railroad, and they were not quite well. It's like there were not as many job opportunities on the West Coast. Industrialization hadn't really occurred in the West as much as it had in the East, and so there was much more competition for jobs on the West Coast than the East Coast. And so the Asians, especially the Chinese, were discriminated against. This was more of a detention center. And eventually there would be some legislation passed in which these immigrants, Asian immigrants, would be held for a period of time before they could enter the United States. But we'll get to that more in a little bit. Here are some photos of Ellis Island and Angel Island. Now, like I said before, with all these millions of immigrants coming into the United States, there was going to be some, the people living in the United States, there's going to be some, they were not going to be happy with the fact that they were now going to have more competitors for their jobs. They seemed to forget quickly that, this country was founded upon immigration. So an anti-immigration movement began. And these were some of the reasons why Americans opposed immigration. They didn't like the competition for jobs. Much of this immigration was leading to problems in the cities, overcrowding in the cities, because this is where most of the jobs were located. This is where the factories were located. And they didn't really have the infrastructure to deal with this massive influx of population. And also, they were, a little bit concerned with the ethnic diversity and customs that these immigrants were bringing in. And so for the first major time in American history, there would be a movement to stand up, oppose immigration.
Hey, get out right now. It's the end of you and me. It's too late and I can't wait for you to be gone.
Here is a political cartoon. It says the effects of immigration according to unions: out of work, this man's out of work, he's lost his job, maybe to an immigrant who's willing to work for less. And so a movement called nativism emerged, and the nativists were, they started the anti-immigration movement in the United States, and they wanted to favor those native-born to the United States by giving them jobs over immigrants and so forth. The problem is immigrants would work for, quite a bit, lower wages, and they would work harder in many cases because they saw this as their opportunity. And so the first political party emerged. It was a party out of California called the Know Nothing Party, and they were successful. They were able to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first legislation restricting immigration in the United States. And it was completely racist. It was solely aimed at Chinese immigrants, and it started in California. All of this started in California. And the Chinese Exclusion Act stated that Chinese would be forbidden from entering into the United States unless they could prove they had a relative. So this is when they were being held at Angel Island, and if they could not prove that they had a relative living in the United States, they would be sent back. This is not the only discrimination that took place in California. In San Francisco and other cities in California, they would not allow Asian children into public schools. And eventually the Supreme Court ruled that they did have to allow these children, especially the ones that were born in the United States. They said that these were, according to the 14th Amendment, citizens of the United States, and that they would be allowed to go into public school. So no Chinese wanted. The second part of this lecture deals with urbanization. And urbanization is directly tied to immigration and the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created more and more jobs in the city level. Prior to this time period, the majority of Americans lived in rural areas. They lived outside of cities. But a major transformation occurred during this era. In 1880, 20% of the population lived in cities, and there were 12 cities with a population over 100,000. By 1900, 38% of Americans lived in cities, and there were 18 cities with a population of over 100,000. By 1920, 68% of Americans lived in cities, and there were 26 cities with a population of over 100,000. So this major transformation occurred where Americans had been spread out prior to industrialization. Now people were moving to the cities, which led to overcrowding, and there were some significant issues that arose from this transformation. First of all, prior to this, mainly the rich lived in the cities. The rich had nicer places, and now you had all these poor people coming in. Immigrants were poor. They piled into the cities, and so now you had the rich and the poor living very closely together, and it really, opened people's eyes to the difference between the rich and the poor, the major gap of income and disparity that had occurred here. Well, also during this time there was an improvement in transportation and in cities with railroads and eventually subways and so forth, so they made it easier to move around in the city. So as a result, cities changed. You had the development of suburbs, and the rich did not want to live so closely to the poor, and so they moved out to the outskirts of town, little nicer area that hadn't been overrun with people, and this is where they began to live, and this was the beginning of the suburbs. Also, you had the development of slums, which were the areas of city where there were high crime rates. This is where the poor people lived in cheap buildings, crammed together, as you'll see in some photos. And also, ghettos were established. And ghettos are kind of given a negative connotation today, but the true definition of a ghetto is an area in a city where a certain ethnic group resides. Okay, and so an example would be Chinatown or Little Italy, things of this nature. I'm living in a city, I take a long time to see it. Living in the city, I keep right, not there in no dream. Living in the city, I keep right, long time to see it. Here you can see a list of the major cities in 1910 and their population. New York City was the largest city with a population of nearly 5 million. Chicago was second. Philadelphia, most of these larger cities you could see were in the east or the Midwest around the Great Lakes region. You have to go down to number 11, San Francisco, which was the largest city in the West, and it only had a population of 400,000. Here's a photo, immigrant neighborhoods. You can see how jam-packed they were together. This would be kind of the poor area of town. Immigrants tended to move where they knew people from the old world, so they wanted to keep their customs and culture alive. A lot of these immigrants that came over had their own schools to teach their children, their own culture. They did not want them going to public schools. However, some of the poor immigrants that came over there, they could not afford to have their children to go to school. It wasn't mandatory for their children to go to school, so they sent them off to work. And this picture shows the whole family that was sitting down working to make ends meet. Because of this massive influx, there were some problems that were encountered, and the biggest one was poor sanitation. The infrastructure, sewer, and so forth was not capable of handling this massive influx of people. So as a result of all these people living so closely together, diseases spread quickly. Cholera was out, yellow fever was rampant. There was some corruption with political machines and corrupt city bosses taking control of the cities and city services, increased crime rates. So the city was not quite as safe as a place to be as it had been in the past. And that wraps up our lecture 5 for Unit 4. Today we've gone over immigration and urbanization and how those two tied to the era of industrialization.